The lights dim, the arena rumbles with anticipation, and the air crackles with electricity. Thousands of fans hold their breath, their eyes fixed on the entrance ramp, waiting for two of the most dominant fighters in their respective worlds to make their way to battle. On one side stands a man who has ruled the octagon with his fists, a fighter whose name is synonymous with precision, power, and an unbreakable Conor McGregor. On the other side, a legend from the world of sports entertainment, a towering figure whose very presence commands fear and respect, the Undertaker. This isn't just a fight. It's a collision of two worlds, a moment in history that no one thought could ever happen. And yet, here we are, moments away from an unprecedented showdown between MMA's most notorious striker and WWA's most dominant force. But how did it come to this? It started as a whisper in the combat sports world, a rumor that no one dared to take seriously. Conor McGregor, a man who made his fortune in real fights, throwing real punches, was being linked to a match with The Undertaker, a figure known for his dominance in scripted combat. To many, the idea seemed ridiculous. What business did McGregor, a former two-division UFC champion, have stepping into the world of professional wrestling? And why would The Undertaker, a man who had spent 3 decades as the face of WWE, entertain the idea of fighting an MMA fighter in any capacity? Yet, the moment McGregor made a single comment about pro wrestlers being fake tough guys, the spark had been lit. The Undertaker, a man who had built his legacy on mystique and intimidation, was never one to let a challenge go unanswered. It wasn't long before the internet caught fire with speculation. Was this real? Was this another one of McGregor's mind games? A verbal jab meant to get under the skin of WWA's biggest names? After all, McGregor had never been shy about stirring the pot. He had called out Floyd Mayweather and stepped into a boxing ring, defying all expectations. He had taunted opponents until they broke, made predictions that seemed impossible, and somehow, more often than not, turned those words into reality. But this was something different. This wasn't a sanctioned UFC bout or a carefully promoted boxing match. This was a challenge to the legacy of a man who had spent his career becoming more than just a wrestler. He had become a myth. Then, the impossible happened. The Undertaker responded. He wasn't the kind of man who engaged in social media feuds, nor did he entertain challenges lightly. But McGregor had gotten his attention. A single message, cryptic, but clear, was all it took to send the world into a frenzy. "You run your mouth too much, boy. Let's see if you can back it up." The Undertaker wasn't just a performer. He was a symbol of dominance, a name spoken with reverence in the world of wrestling. And now, he had called out McGregor, a man known for never backing down from a fight. From that moment, the battle lines were drawn. Fans took to social media, debating who would come out on top. On one side, McGregor supporters scoffed at the idea of a professional wrestler standing a chance against a trained fighter. They argued that Undertaker, despite his size and reputation, had spent decades in a world where outcomes were predetermined, where fights were as much about storytelling as they were about physicality. But Undertaker supporters weren't having it. This wasn't just any wrestler. This was a man who had made his career by blending reality with fiction, a fighter who had stepped into the ring with legitimate tough guys and never once shown fear. They pointed to his past, to the stories of him sparring with real fighters behind the scenes, to his love for combat sports, and to the undeniable fact that, scripted or not, The Undertaker had spent 30 years proving that he could take punishment and keep moving forward. The stakes had been set, but the real question remained: how would they fight? Would this be a traditional wrestling match? with rules that favored The Undertaker's experience? Or would McGregor demand something more, a fight with no restrictions, where he could use his full arsenal of strikes and submissions? The debate raged on, but one thing was certain: if this fight was to happen, it needed to be something that neither man had ever faced before. It had to be a spectacle, a fight that blurred the lines between the real and the unreal, a showdown that could only exist in the rare moments when two icons from different worlds collide. The day of the contract signing arrived, and the energy in the air was unlike anything seen before. Cameras flashed, reporters crowded the scene, and fans from both the MMA and wrestling worlds held their breath. McGregor, dressed in a sharp suit, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he tapped his fingers against the table. Across from him, The Undertaker sat in silence, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. The tension was suffocating. The questions had been asked 1,000 times, but now, in this moment, there was only one left. Was this really happening? McGregor leaned forward first, signing his name with a flourish, eyes never leaving the man across from him. Then slowly, The Undertaker reached for the pen. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Every camera in the room was locked on him, waiting, watching. And then he signed. The deal was done. The match was official. The world erupted. As the dust settled and the two men stood up, their eyes locked in a stare that spoke of war. No words were exchanged. None were needed. McGregor, always the showman, let a grin spread across his face. "Hope you're ready, dead man," he muttered, just loud enough for the cameras to pick up. The Undertaker didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply leaned in, voice low, almost a whisper. "You'll find out soon enough." And just like that, the stage was set. Two legends, one fight, no turning back. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. The contract was signed, but the battle had only just begun. As McGregor and The Undertaker left the press conference, the world buzzed with anticipation. Fans debated endlessly. Sports analysts dissected every angle, and social media was flooded with speculation. Who had the real advantage? Was this a fight that favored skill, or did it come down to sheer presence and endurance? While many dismissed it as another high-profile stunt, those who truly understood combat knew that something different was brewing. This wasn't just a cross-promotional event. It was a war between two men who refused to be overshadowed. Behind the scenes, the tension was already rising. McGregor had always thrived in the chaos of a fight buildup, using his sharp tongue to get under his opponent's skin, to force them into mistakes before the battle had even begun. But The Undertaker was different. He wasn't the kind of man who responded with words. He had built his legacy through intimidation, through moments where silence spoke louder than anything else. And now, in the face of McGregor's relentless taunts, he remained unmoved, his expressions unreadable. Every time McGregor mocked him in interviews, calling him too old, too slow, or just another actor pretending to be a fighter, The Undertaker never so much as flinched. But while the world focused on the war of words, something was happening beneath the surface. Both men were preparing in ways no one expected. McGregor, despite his confidence, knew this wouldn't be like any fight he'd ever had. His training shifted. Instead of just sharpening his striking, he started working on strength, endurance, and a different kind of grappling. He studied Undertaker's movements, watched hours of footage, looking for weaknesses, looking for anything that could be exploited. And while he wouldn't admit it publicly, he knew the truth: this wasn't a standard MMA bout, and he needed to be ready for anything. On the other side, The Undertaker was doing something he hadn't done in years. He was stepping back into the world of real combat training. Though his wrestling career had made him larger than life, those who knew him personally understood that there was more to him than just the spectacle. He had trained with real fighters, sparred with legends behind closed doors, and spent decades pushing his body past its limits. Now, as the fight drew closer, he was rediscovering that side of himself. His training was brutal, far removed from the scripted world of WWA. He worked with fighters who tested his endurance, challenged his reflexes, and prepared him for a battle where nothing was predetermined. As the days passed, the stakes continued to rise. Promoters struggled to define the rules. Would it be a no-holds-barred contest, a hybrid match that combined elements of both MMA and wrestling, or something entirely new? Behind the scenes, negotiations dragged on, with neither side willing to give the other an advantage. McGregor wanted it to be as close to an MMA fight as possible, believing his striking and movement would overwhelm the larger man. But the Undertaker's camp refused to agree to terms that eliminated his greatest weapon, his sheer size and ability to absorb punishment. The compromise that was finally reached remained a mystery to the public, adding another layer of suspense. Fans could only speculate. Would McGregor have to fight within the rules of wrestling, or would The Undertaker have to adapt to the brutal realities of an MMA fight? As the fight drew closer, the psychological warfare escalated. McGregor, never one to back down from mind games, intensified his verbal attacks. He appeared on talk shows, calling The Undertaker a relic of a bygone era, claiming that he was going to put the dead man in the grave for real. He released training footage, showcasing his precision, his speed, and his ability to take down men much larger than himself. Every clip was designed to send a message. He was younger, faster, and there was nothing The Undertaker could do to stop him. But then, something unexpected happened. One night during a live interview, McGregor was caught off guard. A video played on the screen behind him, and for the first time, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. It was security footage, grainy but clear Undertaker, in a private gym, sparring with an opponent who looked every bit as dangerous as any real fighter. The footage wasn't polished, wasn't staged. It was raw. The camera caught every brutal exchange, every moment of exhaustion, every hit absorbed without hesitation. And then came the final shot, The Undertaker, towering over his downed opponent, staring directly into the camera as if he knew McGregor would be watching. No words, just a silent challenge. The reaction was immediate. McGregor, always quick with a response, smiled and shook his head, dismissing it as cute. But for those watching closely, there was something different in his eyes. Just for a split second, the confidence wavered. The world had expected The Undertaker to play the role of the aging veteran, the legend who would be overwhelmed by reality. But now, doubts began to creep in. Was McGregor truly ready for what was coming? Had he underestimated a man who had spent decades mastering the art of survival? The press conference before the fight was unlike anything ever seen before. The energy in the room was overwhelming. McGregor, as expected, was in full form, laughing, taunting, doing everything he could to get a reaction. But The Undertaker remained silent, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere. Then, as the event came to a close, McGregor stood up, microphone in hand, and walked toward his opponent. "I'll tell you what's going to happen," he said, his voice filled with the bravado that had made him famous. "You're going to walk down that ramp, step into that ring, and realize you should have stayed retired." For the first time, The Undertaker moved. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step forward until he was standing just inches from McGregor. The room went silent. The cameras zoomed in. The world held its breath. Then, In a voice that was barely above a whisper, he spoke. "You talk too much," he said. And with that, he walked away, leaving McGregor standing there, for once, without a comeback. The world was ready. The fight was set. But no one, not the fans, not the analysts, not even McGregor himself, could have predicted what would happen next. The night of the fight had arrived, but something felt different. The air inside the arena was thick with anticipation, yet there was an undercurrent of unease, as if the crowd sensed they were about to witness something beyond the realm of what they had expected. McGregor, as always, made his entrance with the confidence of a man who had already won. His walk was sharp, precise, his gaze locked forward as if the very idea of doubt had never entered his mind. The crowd erupted as he stepped into the ring, his usual smirk playing on his lips. But then, the lights dimmed and the atmosphere shifted. A slow, ominous bell tolled, and for a moment everything stood still. The sound cut through the arena like a knife, sending chills down the spines of even the most hardened spectators. Then, through the smoke, a towering figure emerged. The Undertaker walked with an eerie calm, his presence alone enough to silence the roar of the crowd. There was no rush, no theatrics beyond what was necessary. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, and carried the weight of decades of dominance. McGregor leaned against the ropes, arms crossed, trying to appear unfazed, but there was something in his eyes, something almost imperceptible, that betrayed the slightest hesitation. The referee stepped between them, quickly going over the final instructions. McGregor barely listened, nodding absent-mindedly, his eyes locked onto his opponent. The Undertaker, on the other hand, didn't move, his expression unchanging, unreadable. The bell rang, and McGregor exploded forward, his speed on full display. His fists flew in a flurry of sharp, precise strikes aimed at the bigger man's ribs and jaw. It was a strategy he had mastered: overwhelm, control, dominate. But as his punches landed, something unexpected happened. The Undertaker barely reacted. McGregor's fists connected cleanly, his strikes crisp and powerful, yet the man before him barely flinched. It wasn't a case of simply absorbing damage. There was something almost unnatural about the way the Undertaker took the hits. McGregor had faced men who could endure punishment before, but this was different. It was as if he were striking against something unshakable, something immovable. For the first time in his career, McGregor felt something foreign creeping into his mind. A question. Doubt. Then, without warning, the Undertaker moved. One massive hand shot forward, gripping McGregor's throat with terrifying precision. It wasn't a wild grab, it was controlled, effortless, as if he had been waiting for the exact moment to strike. The crowd gasped as McGregor struggled, his arms flailing as he tried to pry himself free. But the grip was iron. Slowly, the Undertaker lifted him, the sheer strength on display sending shockwaves through the arena. And then, with devastating force, he slammed McGregor onto the mat. The impact was thunderous, the kind that made the canvas shudder beneath them. McGregor rolled, stunned, momentarily unable to process what had just happened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had trained for this, prepared for every possible scenario. But this was something else. As he pushed himself up, trying to shake off the shock, he realized something else had changed. The crowd, which had always been loud, was eerily quiet. It wasn't just awe, it was something deeper. A collective realization that the fight they had expected might not be the one they were about to witness. McGregor wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Shaking off the pain, he regrouped, switching tactics. He circled, staying light on his feet, using his agility to his advantage. He darted in and out, peppering the Undertaker with sharp kicks to the legs and body, forcing him to move, forcing him to react. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, McGregor sawed an opening. The Undertaker's stance shifted just slightly, his balance momentarily compromised. McGregor lunged, aiming a brutal left hook directly at his opponent's jaw. And then, something happened that no one could have predicted. As McGregor's fist connected, the Undertaker didn't just absorb the hit, he smiled. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A slow, knowing grin that sent a chill through the room. McGregor's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, but that was all it took. In that moment of hesitation, the Undertaker struck. A massive right hand crashed into McGregor's ribs, sending him staggering. Before he could recover, a second blow landed, this time to the side of his head. The world blurred. McGregor had taken countless hits in his career, had stood toe-to-toe with the best fighters on the planet, but this was something he had never felt before. It wasn't just power, it was a force that seemed almost unreal. As he stumbled back, struggling to regain control, he caught sight of the Undertaker advancing. No rush, no wasted motion, just the slow, inevitable march of a man who knew exactly how this was going to end. McGregor wasn't out of the fight yet. Summoning every ounce of willpower, he forced himself forward, launching a desperate assault. The crowd roared as he unleashed a brutal combination, every strike thrown with the kind of precision and desperation that had made him a legend. And for a moment, it looked like he was turning the tide. The Undertaker staggered, forced to take a step back. The energy in the arena shifted. Was this it? Had McGregor finally cracked the puzzle? But then, with a terrifying finality, the Undertaker reached out, wrapping his arms around McGregor. And in that moment, the realization hit. This wasn't just a fight. It had never been just a fight. McGregor struggled, twisting, trying to break free, but it was no use. The Undertaker's grip was unrelenting. With a slow, measured motion, he hoisted McGregor high into the air, holding him above the ring for what felt like an eternity. The entire world seemed to pause, every breath held in anticipation. And then, with devastating force, he brought McGregor crashing down. The arena shook. The sound of impact echoed through the building. And as the dust settled, McGregor lay motionless on the mat, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The Undertaker stood over him, unmoving, expression unreadable. The crowd was silent. And then, just as the referee moved in, McGregor's fingers twitched. His breathing steadied. His eyes flickered open. And slowly, impossibly, he began to push himself up. The world seemed to slow as McGregor pushed himself off the mat, his muscles aching, his vision still blurred from the devastating impact. The crowd, once frozen in stunned silence, erupted into a chaotic roar, caught between disbelief and sheer admiration. He was supposed to stay down. No one took a fall like that and got back up. But McGregor was never one to follow expectations. With a deep, shuddering breath, he steadied himself on shaky legs, his eyes locking onto the Undertaker, who still stood unmoving, watching, waiting. A flicker of something crossed the Undertaker's face, not quite surprise, not quite approval, but something in between. He had faced countless opponents, had broken the spirits of warriors who had entered the ring believing they could stand against him. Yet here stood McGregor, battered, bruised, but refusing to surrender. Slowly, McGregor raised his fists again, his knuckles bloodied but firm. If this was how it had to end, he was going to go out swinging. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his body, McGregor exploded forward, launching himself at the Undertaker with a speed that defied the damage he had taken. His strikes came sharp, precise, fueled by sheer willpower. A brutal left connected with the Undertaker's jaw, followed by a vicious knee to the ribs. For the first time, the giant took a step back. The crowd felt it. This was a moment, a shift, a crack in the unshakable force that had dominated the match. McGregor pressed forward, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. He ducked under a massive swing from the Undertaker, countering with a crushing uppercut that sent shockwaves through the arena. The Undertaker staggered, his footing momentarily unstable. And then McGregor saw his chance. With every ounce of power he had left, he leaped, twisting in midair, and drove a devastating spinning kick into the side of the Undertaker's head. The impact sent the giant crashing down. The impossible had happened. The Undertaker was on the mat. The energy in the arena shifted, an electrified tension gripping every spectator. McGregor stumbled back, barely able to stand, his breath ragged, but his eyes never left the fallen figure before him. He had fought monsters in the cage, had stood toe-to-toe with legends, but this felt different. He had taken on something larger than life, something that should have been unbeatable, and now, for the first time, he had put the Undertaker down. But the match wasn't over. McGregor knew better than to assume victory too soon. Every instinct screamed at him to finish it, to land the final blow before the Undertaker could rise again. He staggered forward, exhaustion threatening to consume him, and reached down to grab his opponent. But then, as if waking from a deep slumber, the Undertaker's eyes snapped open. Before McGregor could react, a hand shot up, gripping his wrist with terrifying strength. The crowd gasped as the Undertaker sat up, his face an unreadable mask. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been knocked to the ground by one of the most precise fighters in the world. McGregor struggled to break free, but the Undertaker's grip tightened. Slowly, methodically, the giant rose to his feet, dragging McGregor up with him. McGregor fought, twisting, throwing desperate strikes, but it was too late. The Undertaker lifted him into the air with eerie ease, holding him for what felt like an eternity. And then, with finality, he brought McGregor crashing down into the mat with a thunderous impact. The referee dropped to the ground for the count. 1. McGregor's fingers twitched. 2. The crowd held its breath. 3. The bell rang. It was over. The match had been fought, the war waged, and in the end, the Undertaker stood victorious. But as he looked down at McGregor, something had changed. He didn't leave immediately. He didn't revel in the win. Instead, he extended a hand. For a moment, McGregor didn't move, his body too battered to respond. But then, slowly, he reached up and grasped the offered hand. The crowd erupted, not in celebration of victory or defeat, but in recognition of what had just taken place. This wasn't just a match, it had been something more. A battle, not just of strength, but of spirit. McGregor had lost, but he had never been broken. And in the silent exchange between the two warriors, there was an understanding respect earned, not given. As McGregor stood, the Undertaker gave him a slow nod before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows as mysteriously as he had arrived. McGregor, breathing heavily, looked around at the roaring crowd, wiping the sweat and blood from his face. He had fought legends before, but this night, this battle would be remembered forever.